Hello, and welcome to the 19th first event of 2023. I'm Amanda Zamora, co-founder and publisher of the 19th. This month marks the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, the landmark Supreme Court decision that made abortion a constitutionally protected right in this country. The decision afforded generations of women and pregnant people greater autonomy over their reproductive rights. But as we know, that progress was halted abruptly in June of last year, when after 49 years, the High Court overturned Roe versus Wade. So today, we'll examine this reversal with a series of conversations about the legal, historical, and societal impacts of Roe and what our nation's future holds without it. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Houston-based philanthropist and a founding donor of the 19th, Laura Arnold. A quick reminder that while sponsors help keep the 19th event free for viewers like you to attend, they play no part in the programming of these conversations. Now, let's get into today's conversation, which you can join by sharing insights and comments with the hashtag the19thlive. With that, I'd like to welcome Karen Hawkins, the 19th story editor, who's here to lead a conversation with an amazing group of women, here to reflect on what Roe has meant for their generations. Karen?
Thank you, Amanda. We are beginning today by talking with women of 4 different generations about Roe, what Roe has meant to them, and their work for abortion rights and reproductive justice. We don't have these kinds of intergenerational conversations enough, and we're really excited for these folks to be in community and conversation with each other and with all of you. I will give brief introductions of our folks today. We will start with Eleanor Smeal, president and co-founder of the Feminist Majority Foundation. She's also publisher of Ms. Magazine. She has been organizing around abortion since before Roe v. Wade, and she is here representing the baby boom generation. Rebecca Walker is author of Women Talk Money, Breaking That Taboo. She also produced the film Women's March, This is Personal. She is here representing Gen X and is considered one of the founders of third wave feminism. Thank you for being here. Jenny Yang, stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and host. She has been working to help raise funds for clinics and has been outspoken about her own experience with abortion. She is here representing millennials. Get it, Jenny? And last but not least, Olivia Juliana is Director of Politics and Governmental Affairs at Gen Z for Change, a youth-led nonprofit. Last year, Olivia raised $2 million in abortion funds across the country. Congratulations on that. Welcome, everyone. I love the raise through. Welcome, everyone. So I'll start with kind of maybe the most depressing one, which was, where were you when you heard that Roe was leaving us? And what was your immediate reaction? And that can be either the leak of the decision in May, that can be the actual decision in June. Where were you? What were you thinking? What was your immediate reaction to it?
For me, finding out the Roe leak had happened was it felt very much like the timing of it was almost comedic, because the day that the leak came out, I had woken up and driven to Austin, Texas to do some filming for a documentary. And the final question that I had been asked was, do you think Roe v. Wade will be overturned? And my response was, it is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And as soon as I pulled into my driveway back here in Houston and got in my house was when the leak dropped that the Supreme Court's intention was to overturn Roe v. Wade. I honestly wasn't surprised. I think abortion rights activists and reproductive justice organizers have known for several years that this was coming. As someone who's so young, I was 19 at the time that Roe was overturned. I think that for me, the sign that it was coming was when the Supreme Court refused to hear the case concerning Texas's civil bounty law. Was kind of the green light to me that the arguments that violated the precedent that was set in Roe v. Wade wouldn't matter, because Roe v. Wade wouldn't be in place anymore. So it was almost comedic, the timing in which I found out, but it was a very solemn moment to kind of reflect on the fact that you hope that those gut feelings you have about it happening aren't true. But unfortunately, they turned out to be.
When the leak came out, I wasn't surprised at the conclusion that they're going to overturn it. What I was shocked by is how awful the decision was. It was not just affecting abortion, but the threat that it would affect birth control, the fact that it would same-sex marriage, but then the attack on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which essentially said it doesn't forbid sex discrimination. And there's so many cases that were determined on it. So it was shocking and poorly written, and I kept hoping that somehow it'd be cleaned up on the second time around. As you know, it wasn't. And it's a remarkably horrible decision.
It was so broad, right? Like,
right.
It seemed really very radical. I think that was my first impression. Like the way that it's not just attacking Roe, but questioning some fundamental ideas that we thought were immutable, right? I mean, I feel like that was what was breathtaking.
It struck me as particularly cruel how I believe it was Justice Amy Coney Barrett who was using economic terms to discuss adopted children, like using the terms supply and demand.
It was so gross. It's so gross.
I as somebody who has seen what the foster care and CPS system is like firsthand, doing advocacy here in Texas, my heart sank knowing that like that is how they're talking about the children who they claim to care about. Those are the terms they're using to describe them. It was so disgusting to me.
Yes. Well, I was in my living room and I can remember every color, the temperature. My wife was cooking in the kitchen. I remember everything about it. And I heard it, not the leak, but the actual decision. And it was like I had been just hit on my body, just my whole body. I felt it all through my stomach, my chest, my heart. And it was as if the tanks were rolling in. It was as if it was the war had landed and it became that much more visceral. The attack. And you know, I feel the attacks of white supremacy, of hypercapitalism, of everything that we're living through constantly. So it's not as if I'm immune from this feeling of horror and dismay and injury, but I felt it very, very deeply at that moment. It felt like another step toward fascism and authoritarianism. And I felt a deep concern, not just for women's reproductive freedom, but also for human sovereignty. You know, for me, the idea that obviously that government, that the corporate infrastructure can control our bodies, to me is a far-reaching decision. This is not about just controlling our reproductive rights. This is about being able to come in and tell us what we can say, what we can do, how we can perform, how we can act, who we can love, all of those things. So I felt this incredible sense of doom. And I was very surprised. And actually, Olivia, when you just said that you were not surprised, I got very, emotional. It's very emotional for me, actually, and I'm still emotional to hear young people who feel that there's a kind of inevitability to the fall of these things, because we, in my generation, I believe, we did not feel that kind of inevitability. And I think that gave us a great deal of strength and sense of belief in this world that we're living in. And I think, I have a son who's 18. It's very important for me that he believes that freedom is possible. And so to hear that your generation, so many of you feel this inevitable sense, it's heartbreaking for me at another level. So, but I also felt the need to get back to work and never stop, So there was also that, and there was a conversation with my son, and there was a conversation with young people, and there were conversations like this. So it's never all lost, but that was my initial feeling.
I felt that when you said that sort of heartbreak about expectations being different. As a geriatric millennial, as they like to call me, I and as someone who isn't necessarily on the front lines of abortion advocacy like you all are, but who obviously tries to keep track, I found myself surprised in my heart, if that makes sense. Like in my head, when you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, of course. All the news that came up, all the signs, all of the erosion of rights, of bodily autonomy has been happening. That's in my head, but in my heart, it was a heartbreak. It was a heartbreak. It was a like, oh, the first, second wave feminists, they fought so hard. The shoulders that we stood on, there's this, maybe, as my generation, I had some ignorant sense of progress. I think it's attached to maybe even the thoughts around racial progress, like Obama, like the how so many liberals had even, gotten so confused when there was a sense of regression after Obama was elected. Like I felt a little of that, but in my heart around abortion, if that makes any sense. If I could, try to make an analogy, right? It's like there's this right and there's this privilege that I felt like we probably took for granted, as someone who wasn't on the front lines of abortion activism. And I think a lot of people who are my peers felt that way too. There was that sense of heartbreak. And as someone who is, at a certain age where, reproductiveness is not, I want to get an abortion, but maybe I want to keep a baby. The fact that how broad, right, the rights attack on reproductive health, even in that sense, even in terms of IVF being thrown in there, of having a miscarriage, that just blew my mind. That was what really, from where I stand as someone who wants a baby now, it really upset me. It really upset me that was such a fundamental challenge to what I thought would be a right as an American.
I would add too, I'm just thinking about your generation and my role in third wave feminism. And one of the things that I did think, and that I think often about, which is that one of the things that we articulated within the third wave kind of missive or mission was a sense that we needed to build a bridge between younger women and older women. And so part of what we were, and what I was very invested in, was trying to find a language that could reinvigorate the movement. My fear was that the kind of the hatred of feminism, of feminists, of women, was going to wipe out a whole generation of activists. And so as part of the kind of marketing, the movement of, the marketing of our movement, one of the things that I talked a lot about was the need to deconstruct a kind of totalizing feminist identity. And so in many talks that I gave around the country at that time, 300 talks, I talked a lot about how important it is to include women who were anti-abortion into the feminist community. That was a very important thing for me at the time because I felt it was necessary. And because obviously you can be anti-abortion, you don't want, fine, don't have an abortion. Great, you don't have to, but just support my right too, So I was really trying to do something with that idea. And when I heard this, and when I've heard many other things, I often wonder about those ideas and how those bore out. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I hold myself accountable, and I want, I have to really, and I think every movement person, every person and every activist, every person who's speaking on issues has to really reflect on the experiment that we're involved in and think about what we've said and how we've contributed to this moment. And that's definitely been on my mind, Mm-hmm. And I talk to young women and I just think, wow, we were really talking about a kind of inclusivity, a kind of empowerment around sexuality, for instance, and I see what's happening with young women. I think, wait a minute, was that actually, is this what we wrought? This kind of low self-esteem and discomfort around sexuality and feeling of being unsafe when you have a tough conversation, and but at the same time, full display of one's body in ways that aren't really comfortable and aren't really safe. And I think, Jesus, is this was not what I had in mind, within the language of sex positivity, and which was very important to third wave. So I think it's a complicated moment for many of us who had very strong ideas and are now perhaps having a deeper understanding of how some of those ideas have played out and how they can be manipulated by the culture and not fully excavated and taken at with the intention that they were presented.
The thing I think that I thought immediately, and I think that the time has proven it. I believe that the young woman would be there, and they're so strongly for us. I'm a student of polling and polls, and we have the greatest strength among the young. But I was even surprised how much strength we had all over. And we did a poll right before the election, and they were talking about a red wave. And I said, no, they're not going to have a red wave because they blew apart women's rights. And we're not going to forget it. And our polling showed that young women, 18 to 29, were conditioning their vote on the candidate's stand on abortion. And if they weren't for choice, forget them. They were opposed to them. And basically women over were also opposed, but not as strong, but they were there. And what happened is, and I think they made a terrible mistake writing such an extreme decision because it's been rejected. And the votes rejected. Young women voted at almost twice in the battleground states I'm talking about now, almost twice of their normal vote, and totally opposed to a red wave. And that's why we didn't have one. It became the issue. No matter how many times Fox News or NBC or something, MSNBC, CNN would talk about the red wave, it didn't materialize. And I believe it's because of this issue. They still have trouble telling us that it was the number one issue, but it was among women.
Yes.
And so I feel that they made a mistake by writing such an extreme decision. We never had a chance, but this is extreme. It's punitive. It has no compassion. It talks about how women were treated in the 17th century and the 18th century as if this is some standard. So frankly, I think that I thought they were going to nibble us to death. That's what they've been doing. A little here, a little there. It's been nibbling since the decision came down, since Roe. This was no nibble. This was a giant step backwards, and I think they're going to regret it.
Thank you for reminding us. Yeah, no, that's actually, let it be written in the history books that was a mistake that they made, and that's right. Actually, because I do remember seeing polls too that just reminded people like, oh, Asian Americans, we support abortion. Like, you know what I mean? Like, take away all of your stereotypes about whatever ethnic group, whatever gender, class. Like, there was a huge surge in voting to support.
Yes, and that's why it's so important, I think, for this next generation to believe that voting actually matters, and that is one of my biggest concerns, that people will give up and not believe in democracy and walk around saying things like, we don't have a democracy, my vote doesn't matter. I mean, the idea of that to me is that is unacceptable. That is untenable. That is the end. And so, when I think about, the younger people, Olivia, when I think about your cohort, the important thing is to remind people that your vote does matter. We would not be here. My people would be enslaved right now if votes did not matter. We would not have many, many, many of the rights that we have. I would not be married to my wife right now if your vote didn't matter. That we are not in a totalitarian regime right now, even though sometimes it may feel that way. We are not. And so I think that is something that we really need to focus on, which is really, giving buoyancy to the idea that your participation is still valid, valuable. It is everything. So yeah,
we got to keep it up.
we got to keep it up.
That's
and
right.
Especially in that 18 to 29 range, where there is a sense of inevitability of the fall and a sense of sort of futility sometimes, and a sort of comfort with, oh, the politicians don't care, it's never going to change, a kind of blasé attitude that is not, it's untenable. It's not going to, it's not based on reality. It's not based on history, and it's not going to help us for the future. So it's a completely useless idea. I mean, you know what I mean? So I think that's something that we have to really spend some time talking about and reinforcing in young people. Yeah, we've got to keep these numbers up. We've got to keep people voting. We've got to keep them engaged, whatever our language needs to be,
I
What
mean,
do you think, Olivia?
I completely agree. I had done several media and television appearances leading up to the election where I said abortion is the issue that young people will vote on. I said that, and I was right. And you're absolutely right about supporting candidates was contingent on their stance on freedom of choice. I did a lot of work on behalf of candidates across this country this past election cycle. And the candidates who I spent the most time with, who I put the most energy into getting elected or reelected, were candidates who had bold pro-choice stances and were unapologetic about it. And that's just the reality. There's been this notion for a really long time that young people don't care, and that young people don't vote. And the reality is, sorry, millennials, Gen Z, at this point, Gen Z in our age group, we are more civically involved than any other generation at this point. So right now, at ages 18 to 24, we're more active than Gen X, millennials, or boomers were. And I do attribute that greatly to the foundation that was laid before we came into this age group. And I think that I'm really starting to see that politics is becoming more accessible with the influence of social media, which is how I got my start in politics and activism, is through social media. And because of that, people are more informed and more aware of what's going on. When it comes to Gen Z, there's this really important perspective that a lot of people don't really understand. And I actually talked about this with Congresswoman Barbara Lee a few weeks ago. I have never lived in a world where 9/11 did not happen. I was born after 9/11. I was born in 2002 into a world where the war on terror consistently existed. I grew up with school shootings being a constant threat. I was a freshman in high school when Parkland happened. I grew up with multiple economic recessions. I was in high school when there was the COVID public health crisis. There are multiple generational traumas that Gen Z has had to deal with. And all while we're dealing with that, we're also being raised in the digital, rapid growing age of technology. So not only are we constantly experiencing these issues and these things that are going on, but we're also hyper informed about every single issue. We're hyper aware of how it affects our lives. And now we have the ability to communicate with each other on a global scale. So when people talk about like turning back the clock on our rights, I think it would have been a lot easier to maintain that if it was happening in a non-digital age. But because tools and resources are so much more readily available to my generation now, it's going to be much more difficult to kind of take grasp of my generation, which is why you see people who are anti-choice now trying to ban TikTok and like put restrictions on social media sites because they understand that this is where we're organizing. And so I'm very proud of my generation. I get very angry at people in my generation sometimes who say things like, our vote doesn't matter, because it does. But I do my best to counteract those narratives and say, look, you don't have to have money or be rich or be white or be straight to make a difference. You can be a 17-year-old making TikToks in your bedroom about why people should vote for President Biden and make a difference. And so I'm just really proud of how far my generation has come and how much of a difference we've been able to make, and even just these recent midterm elections.
Yes.
Yeah, we got to tell them, Olivia, this is the truth. Everyone needs to know, because I feel like, yeah, like I resonate with Rebecca's characterization sometimes of how Gen Z might appear, right? Like, oh, you know, there's so many funny TikToks of like Gen Z just having like chaotic nihilism, you know what I mean, just like about the world and how they can't control things. And I think it is attributed to a lot of the traumas that the generation has experienced in such a short amount of time. It's like, you don't have control over your world, but yet they are hyper aware and hyper informed, which to me, as someone who likes to see the world no matter what, even though I'm a comedian, still as a labor organizer, that means that's a population that's ripe for organizing, right? Like if they're informed and, you know, they just need a little bit of hope and a vision and maybe a path, then that's all we got to give them. And so I love that. I mean, I followed Olivia from Twitter when I was like, yo, who's roasting Matt Gaetz? This is dope. Who is it? Let me follow Olivia. I was like, yes, I will follow Olivia. This is amazing. Let's see this, you know, like, I love that, like, we can use those tools, you know what I mean, to like let the people know how they can act and not just feel hopeless.
The one thing about abortion is, in a way, you don't need mass communication. It affects everybody's lives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is something personal. They don't have to, you know, learn about it someplace else. They feel threatened by it. They feel personally injured, people of childbearing ages. And there's going to be, I mean, the sad part about all this decision is going to cost some people their lives.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be real. This is a horrid decision. But I do think we also have to know we're in a war. They just threw a big blow at us. But they think they can get away with it because they think that young people don't vote and old people won't vote on this issue. They're wrong on both accord, but they have done a lot of voter suppression. And we have got to get rid of the voter suppression. Voter suppression is aimed at young people. It's aimed at people of color. If everybody was voting at the level of in the population, there'd be no problem. But it's constant voter suppression. They're constantly thinking up another trick. And I think it's going to be hard work, but we got to make sure we get rid of voter suppression as well. I mean, all of our issues are intertwined. And I said the polling thing, but the reality is we've got to increase the voting by another 20%. Right. And then we wouldn't have the problems. But to do that, we have got to get rid of the voter suppression. We've got to be collegial. We have to have coalitions that are full of diversity so that we keep all of the groups not only informed, but that we're not working at cross purposes, that we are all in this together. That's the atmosphere. And one of the big difference that we had when Roe was passed, I was started to be active before it was issued, and we thought that we would win. We were always in a very optimistic thing. We would never go backwards. We thought that it was going to keep going. We had just gotten Title IX the year before. Now we got abortion, although it was never a perfect decision. You know, it wasn't really exactly what we wanted, but it was in the right direction. And we were so optimistic every inch of the way. And then somewhere, because we've had so many backlashes, that optimism is not there as much. And I think we've got to keep working on it. The people are with us. We are the majority, but we have to know that we're against an opponent that is using violence, that is using lies, that is using all kinds of awful tactics.
Awful.
We have to beat them.
Yes.
This is really
You know, my
beautiful.
dad, the civil rights attorney I was talking about earlier, said something to me the other day when I was saying, oh, you know, everything, you know, all of your work, my mother's work, everybody's work. And he said, you know, we're not always going to win. We're not always going to be winning. And we're not always going to be losing. You know, we're not always going to be losing. And so we have to remember that, you know, and I said, oh, you know, good. You know, I could hold on to that. And I think we all have to hold on to that because Ellie's right. You know, there's been momentum. We grew up with momentum. And now, you know, but it can't stay this way. It will change and we will make it change. And, you know, I was thinking about you, Olivia, and what you're saying. My activism started when I, you know, whatever. But when I really, you know, when we founded Third Wave, we founded it around voter registration. I was thinking Ellie and Olivia, and we, our first project was a voter registration drive. We got all of these young people on buses and went to cities around the country. And Fund for the Feminist Majority gave us a grant, one of many grants to actually be able to do this project. It was an incredible thing. And we registered voters in supermarkets, in unemployment offices, in housing projects, and all of the places where we thought we could find disenfranchised voters, people who were alienated from the vote, who were not given access. And we registered at that time, it was 20,000 voters. Wow. And it was an incredible, you know, for us, that was an incredible number, you know, because there was no social media, there was no internet to speak of. And now, you know, you can register 20,000 voters through TikTok, you know, encouraging people on TikTok to click this link. I mean, you could do that maybe in an hour or a day or a week or whatever that is. So I agree with you. There is such excitement around the technology and the potential to use that technology and voting and getting people motivated by connecting it to an issue that's important to them is something that you all can do with your facility with social media so brilliantly. For us, it was the Rodney King verdict. It was the fact that the Bush administration was destroying reproductive freedoms on so many different levels. It was a sense of an intersectionality, a sense that, you know, the people in power, the you know, all the people we know were taking away our right to safety and well-being. And that was very motivating. We didn't need social media, as Ellie was saying. It was personal. We felt it, you know, every time we walked out of the house. So, and sometimes in the house. So I think that I'm really hopeful for the potential for social media, even though I'm very concerned about it at the same time. I think one of my big questions right now is, you know, can democracy sustain technocracy? You know, how is technology really going to affect our democracy? Misinformation, the manipulation of human beings through misinformation, through the addiction to the screens, through the scrolling, through this kind of diffuse mental state that is being created, you know, how is that going to actually affect democracy? You know, can they coexist at this level? We've never, who could imagine this? You know,
but I mean, but if you think about it, it makes total sense because we are story bound animals. We don't respond to facts. I think that's what I've learned in the last like 10 years. People don't respond to facts. Like they don't respond to evidence. They will, if you give them a story that moves them, that has an emotional hook that affects them, it stays with them and it might actually change their opinions. And so I don't know, I came into this conversation wanting to take away what's the agenda for us, like as storytellers, activists, as like whatever. And what I'm gathering, if I may, is we got to tell the stories and uplift the stories that need to be heard to provide hope about and about the tactics and the things that we need to know about and be aware of. We need to make sure we fight around the places where we win and the places where we gather to organize, whether that's TikTok or Twitter, whether that's through voting suppression and voters' rights. Like that to me is like, okay, I'm like, this is what's in my head right now of like where we're at, because that was kind of what I was confused about when I was, you know, sort of preparing my brain for this conversation. I was like, wow, like what are the answers to like what needs to happen next for us, you know? And so to me, I don't know if you would agree, but like that is like my summary of like what I've gotten from what you've all talked about. Because to me, some of what I was kind of hooked on in terms of like what how do we get out of this is a little bit of the like I was feeling a little depressed, not gonna lie. Like I was feeling a little like of the Gen Z nihilism, you know what I mean? Of just like straight up like, because I still tour, less so, but I still tour colleges and universities. And I remember like I love reading news, like we know whenever they have headlines about what Gen Z is like, and just like my observations. And one of the things I felt like got really confirmed when I was touring recently at colleges and universities on the East Coast was, I said, I heard that you guys aren't having as much sex now, right? Like now, in comparison to the previous generations at this age, Gen Z is not having as much sex. They're not touching each other. And I like went and talked to them. I was like, is that true? Because like what's really confounding to me is the fact that you guys are like so horny on main, but you don't touch each other. Like that you are so, so all about talking about sex and physicalness, but like maybe not doing it in real life. And so in my head, I really hung on to that and been like, what does that mean? What does that mean for feminism? And what does that mean for like, you know what I mean? Like activism, because like you said, like Rebecca, like third wave, like you learn like, yeah, let's be positive about our bodies. Let's like, it's okay to explore, etc. And like actually do it. But like, and then now it's like, oh no, COVID happened and they're not seeing each other anymore. And what's happening? You know what I'm saying? Like, it was like, that was like the worries in my head when I was thinking about like big picture, what should we be doing?
I think that's a really interesting thing to say. Okay, Olivia, yeah.
I'm sorry. I think that, I mean, my perception on it is in part because of technology. I think it's shifted from people who seek affirmation are not seeking it now through physical intimacy. They're seeking it through digital, like digital response. So likes and comments and stuff like that. And as far as like body positivity and sex positivity goes, I personally don't practice body positivity. I practice body neutrality. It doesn't matter what your body looks like. It doesn't matter what you look like or what you wear. Like you as you physically appear as a person does not matter. It's what's on the inside that matters. And I think that the sex positivity movement, while created with good intentions, was warped by white supremacy and the patriarchy to pervert the minds of young women into thinking being hypersexual is liberation when it is not. Being hypersexual, ultimately, you're still feeding into the patriarchy because you've now objectified yourself for affirmation. Now, that's not me saying that you can't, if you want to sleep with people, that's your prerogative. You're an adult, make decisions. I'm not going to judge you for that. It's more so, I don't want people to equate liberation as a woman to liberation sexually, because I think that your sexuality and the way that you physically appear should have absolutely nothing to do with how you are valued as a person. So I think that there has to be lines drawn in how it's presented, because social media has taken advantage of that. Men have taken advantage of that. But it's really come to this weird place where, like, you're right, like Gen Z isn't as sexually active as other generations. And even like Gen Z and millennials aren't having babies as much either. And I think a part of that, honestly, I think is the fear of, what does it mean to get pregnant in a state where abortion is illegal? What does it mean to get pregnant when I can't afford to buy a house or buy a car or pay for childcare? And I think this goes back to like pre-midterms, how people were saying, well, abortion isn't a kitchen table issue. It is a kitchen table issue because, for one, it's about making decisions about your own body, but it's also an economic issue. We know that one of the main reasons people choose to have an abortion is because they cannot afford to become a parent. And that is the reality, and that is the country that we have built for people, is where you don't have a choice in how this country sustains everyone. And I often say that I'm pro-choice and pro-abortion. And what I mean by that is I am pro-abortion. If you want an abortion, you should be able to get one. But I'm also pro-choice in the aspect of you should get to choose how, when, and if you become a parent. And the reality is there are people in this country who cannot even choose the day in which they give birth because the hospital is an hour and a half away from them, or the hospital in their town doesn't have funding for a gynecologist to get their to start them giving birth. Like, that is the reality that people are facing. And so I think that widening the conversation is being pro-choice isn't just about making choices about your own body as to whether or not you remain pregnant. It's also about, if you are someone who wants to become a parent, we should be creating a country where you do not have to worry about the livelihood and the quality of life of your child.
Absolutely. And that, really speaks to, everything that we've been talking about in terms of the ways in which all of these things are connected. I think that, as the mother of an African-American young man, the decision for Black people to have children in this country is incredibly fraught. I worry every day about what can happen to my son outside, and so to be able to transform this country into a place where people want to bring children, into a place where people feel safe and confident bringing children, and also not bringing children, exactly what you're saying, the choice, because looking around at what's going on, we it might be a smart idea not to bring more children here, because of everything that we're talking about, in terms of the means of production, in terms of, when we get into GDP, when we get into women's labor, the labor we put into raising children and thinking about how we are actually raising the next workforce. We are raising the bodies that will contribute to the next iteration of this capitalist world that we are in. And for us not to even be thought about in terms of remuneration, for us not even to be thought about in terms of caretakers, and we are actually literally creating the economy of the future, like from our very bodies, so the intersection of economics, of race, of gender, of sexuality, of the environment. What kind of environment are we bringing these children into? What kind of environment are we choosing to avoid bringing them into? They're just, it's so complex and yet very simple, fix the world, you know what I mean? Do the right thing, think about how to make this place, inhabitable, safe. And that includes restoring rights to women and people of color to have sovereignty over our bodies and our lives. And that brings us back to voting for people who support those freedoms and running for office. I think what you're saying, Jenny, about storytelling and elevating some stories, and that's all very important. And I also say to young people, I want you to become lawyers. I want you to become activists. I want you to run for office. We need that. We need that kind of boots on the ground. I want you to be going into social policy. I want you to be going into think tanks. I want you, you need to think the way Goldwater thought. We are building an infrastructure for the future that we can't even imagine. So we need to be thinking in a very smart way, about how we're going to secure something 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, which is what they were thinking, which is why we are where we are now. This is not a new idea. This has been in the works for a very, very long time. You could take this all the way back to slavery. You could take this back, you could just, and so the level of strategy that we need to understand, the depth of intention and brilliance that we need to bring to bear on this situation is profound. And Ellie, I know you're going to say something brilliant now. Yes. Bring us back to reality, honey. Ground us.
Well, you brought me back to reality when we're out there organizing and trying to get more people to vote. And we have a youth campaign that's very large, and I'm glad they gave you a grant. But the reality is, who are our allies? The civil rights movement, Black Voters Matter, the anti-gun people, and the climate change people.
Yes.
And that climate change is what you're talking about. What are we leaving people when we know all the scientists are saying what we're doing is too dangerous for the survival of the planet as we know it? I mean, we never thought we would have to deal with that issue. I can tell you when we were young, we never had to deal with that issue. We knew there was a population explosion and things like that, but we didn't know what we know now, that the very climate we're dependent upon is changing. And you have these people who won't accept people's votes. They're voter deniers. The deniers are also climate deniers. So the current generation of, I get them all mixed up, Gen Z, whatever, all the names, all the people, young people, they have a tremendous responsibility, but so do older people. We got to bound together, and we got to get more respect for democracy and science. Yes. And women's rights and people of color, but it all binds together. That's the joyful thing about it, is that when the decision came down, people, especially young women, knew instinctively, it wasn't a money for a big ad campaign or anything like that, that we needed the Equal Rights Amendment more than ever. Yeah. That women had no guaranteed rights, and it immediately when Black voters matter, but we still can't get the laws changed. We're fighting some of the same voter suppression that Martin Luther King was fighting, and nothing's changed on that, or very little. We went backwards because of a bad Supreme Court decision. But I do believe this will bring the movements together, and the age groups together. I'm hoping that we see each other as allies for a better world.
Yes, a woman, a people. And also one of the third wave things, and is very relevant for right now, and we have to remember to include this in all of our conversations, is that this is not just a women's issue, that men are deeply involved in this issue. When my son heard this decision, he was deeply upset, deeply affected, because it is also his future. He is responsible for any child he brings into this world. He knows that his stepsister, he knows that his mother, he knows that the women he cares about will be burdened. He knows that women will die. He understands that. And he also will put himself on the line for that. And we must continue to iterate that this is a all gender issue. This is bringing people into the world takes both, and both have deep feelings about this. And we need those allies as well. We need to count men as our allies now and forever, the ones who are. And there are many men who will stand up and vote for choice, and we can't leave them out of the conversation because they then feel diminished. Again, to reference my white father, who worked in the civil rights movement, who counseled Dr. King, who was at many points told, okay, whitey, get out, be quiet. Your place is done. Your role is done here. It diminishes white people's feeling that they can actually invest in the movement without being injured by it. And that's something that we need to really learn from when we talk about the need to include men into our language and discourse around freedom of choice and access to reproductive justice.
Y'all, mission accomplished. I disappeared. I cannot tell you how riveted I am by all of you. Thank you all so much. All right, so last question. You have 30 to 45 seconds to answer, because this is one of the questions I hear most from people who are not activists, who feel broadsided and heartbroken. What can people do who have been asleep this whole time? Maybe not since 2016, but what can ordinary, non-activist, I'm an accountant, how can I help? What can I do? And Ellie, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm hoping that they don't feel that they can't do anything, but that would be, we say how hard things are. It's also a lot of fun to be fighting for these things. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but there's camaraderie, there's a friendship, there's sisterhood and brotherhood. So, but you got to do it. And I think you'll be rewarded if you do. More than I can tell you, the movement has given each of us, the movement for change, more than we probably have been able to give. So I just want to make a little more optimistic there. And I do think everybody counts.
Rebecca, I'll go to you.
Well, what Ellie said is so moving and so true, and I want to read, to magnify that there is real joy in resistance. There is real power. There's real self-knowledge. There's real community when you work together with people who are committed to standing for something greater than themselves. And at this point in our culture, human beings, we desperately need to feel that place in our bodies and our minds, the sense of being aligned with something that is deeply important to us and to the world. And so I agree with Ellie, this movement for change, all of these movements that have brought us into being, that we engage with, have given us so much more than we've probably given them. And I think we do need to remind people of that, to help them understand why it's important.
Thank you, Jenny. I'll go to you. And then Olivia, I'll have you bring us home.
If I were just an everyday accountant, I'd use my numbers knowledge to help out in any way I could. I mean, the movement needs numbers, you know what I'm saying? But seriously, I think I always go back to, in any kind of activist conversations about what can we do, I always go back to like starting where you are, which is, how do we create a sense of community and togetherness, whether it's through your friend circle or your workplace. Like, when there's an opportunity for voting to happen, organize your friends through a group chat or through an email list, the way you would buying tickets for Coachella. Which weekend are you going to? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, people just they know how to do that. Let's just apply some of that sort of communication and togetherness and accountability and bringing folks together, like the way you would bring together people for a birthday party, but apply that for when an important election comes up. Like, hey, does everyone know the information about the candidates? Who are you voting for? Like, I feel like we've been doing that, but I think everyday people need to remember that is always within their reach.
Vote. And don't just vote in the presidential election or the midterms. Your county judges, your sheriffs, your district attorneys, they can all have an effect on whether or not people are prosecuted for getting access to an abortion or for helping others get access to an abortion. And it's not just about voting yourself in each and every election you can. It's also about volunteering to work for candidates that fall in line with our mission for a country where people can make decisions about their own body. No, no door knocked, no phone call made, no text sent. No part in fighting for our democracy is too small. Every single thing matters. Every second of energy spent organizing matters. And you don't have to be somebody who is giving speeches across the country or getting millions of views online, or who is an elected official. You can be an everyday person having a kitchen table conversation with your loved ones about why they should also be voting and still make a difference.
Yes. And give money to the National Network of Abortion Funds if you want to give $5. I mean, third wave, we gave emergency grants to people who needed abortions, within 48 hours. We don't do that anymore, but now you can just go to the National Network of Abortion Funds and just easily give to many different groups. I mean, that's a very easy thing you could do right now after listening to us, I think everybody should be stocking up on mifepristone, the medical abortion, the pills, because we're going to need to be able to get those out to people. Possibly, we don't know. I mean, those kind of practical things, learn how to be a volunteer and accompany women to clinics. I mean, all of those things that are kind of basic, we shouldn't forget as well.
This was a wonderful conversation. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to spend time with you all. Fantastic.
Yes. Nice seeing everybody.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here for our next panel with three of the smartest legal minds in helping us understand the post-Dobbs world. Today, joining me, we have Dahlia Lithwick, who covers legal affairs for Slate. We have Rhiannon Hamam, an attorney in Texas and the host of the 5 to 4 podcast. And we have Hillary Schneller, an attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights and the co-lead counsel in the Dobbs case. So let's jump right in. This will sound like an obvious, large question, but I'd love for us to begin by just asking, what are the biggest new legal questions the Dobbs ruling has forced us to deal with? Dahlia, perhaps you'd like to go first?
I think there is a whole new world of, and I think we'll probably touch on a lot of them, ways in which Dobbs inflects on speech and speech questions. We're already seeing universities who are not able or feel that they're not able to give guidance to students. There's questions about what journalists can write. So I think that there is a whole new massive set of questions around speech and advocacy. I think that the big, really hard questions, and they're the ones that I don't even know if we've begun to think about addressing, is the interstate piece of this. What are we going to do about putting medication abortion in the mails? What are we going to do about a state like Texas that is going to try to prohibit someone from traveling out of state to get an abortion? What are we going to do about companies that say, we'll move you from state to state to get an abortion? So I think that in a lot of ways, and this is depressingly harkens back to the Fugitive Slave Act, but I think there are just a whole host of questions about what you do when you have vastly different laws from state to state and no real template for how to think about enforcement. And maybe the other piece, I mean, there's so much of this, but I think the other piece, and we're already seeing this start to happen, is what do you do in states where, for instance, we just recently heard from the Attorney General in Alabama that, well, when we told you we're going to go after providers and not pregnant people, what we meant was we're also going after pregnant people. And so the whole slippage between who it is that's going to be the target of abortion laws, I think is all just, we haven't begun to parse some of this stuff, and it's going to percolate in very, very different ways in different states and in very different ways in different federal courts.
I can jump in. I mean, something that I am concerned about, and I think we would be remiss if we weren't talking about it, is increased criminalization across the country of pregnancy-related action and pregnancy outcomes. And of course, what all that means, right, not just for women and trans people in accessing necessary healthcare, but what that means in terms of perpetuation of racial hierarchy and mass incarceration in the US, right? So I think Dahlia made a really good point about who is targeted by certain laws. I think in the context of criminalization, one thing to point out is that the way most abortion bans operate generally right now is that they criminalize or create civil liability for providers. But the criminalization of pregnancy outcomes in these kind of new and darkly creative ways is a way for the state to target the pregnant person directly, right? So, for example, state laws that redefine personhood, fetal personhood now, are going to expand criminal liability. You'll see pregnancy outcomes criminally charged as child abuse, as neglect, manslaughter, or murder, right? The criminalization of medication abortion, including to label the selling or procurement of medication abortion as drug trafficking, right? There are lots of examples of ways that pregnancy outcomes, pregnancy-related activity or behavior is going to be criminalized. How that plays out in federal courts and in terms of how we fight back against that, I'm really interested in strategy that sort of uses the constitutional protections of gender equality, right? Most of these laws target women, target pregnant people. And so, that is definitely something to think about in the new legal landscape.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the list a little bit and note that, the list is a little unending. Often in my day-to-day life now, I feel like I'm just a risk spotter, right? I didn't become a lawyer just to spot risks for our clients and the people that they provide care to, and there is a risk of sort of the over compliance, right? We can have an unending list of, if you do this, there might be a risk. If you do this, there might be a prosecutor who's going to take a chance, and the fear and chilling effect that laws have, right? We saw that with SB 8 as, a huge example. But that has spread across the country, that people are not even sure what the law is, right? What is an abortion? Is miscarriage care included? Are other pregnancy outcomes included? So the harm sort of spreads to all of these areas. And the other thing I was just going to note is, when Mississippi asked the court to overrule Roe, and when the court did that, they said, this will, bring certainty and, workability, and just bring this back to the states. And, we always knew that wasn't true, but I think what we're actually seeing and will continue to see really puts the lie to whatever, neutrality or certainty overruling Roe would bring. It's just chaos and a lot of harm, and a lot of harm we could predict, and more that we really can't see necessarily around the corner.
And at the risk of asking the obvious question, what does all this uncertainty, what do these questions around traveling out of state for care or providing care across state lines or any of these matters, what do they mean for patients and the folks who are trying to access care?
It's a mess. It's really hard, right? Providers are taking risks in certain states where they feel they, have maybe the ability to do that, where maybe they're in an access state or in a county that doesn't have a prosecutor that has indicated they're going to act in a kind of wild way. But it's really tough, and sort of each pairing of states where a person might be traveling to or getting care from may have sort of a different risk analysis. Different providers, different patients will take different risks, and also people just have different levels of information, right? If all we're saying is if all they're hearing is risk, people before Roe was overruled, and even more so now, think abortion is banned across the country, right? That's not true. It is available in about half of the states, but what does that mean in reality for people actually trying to get care? And, as was mentioned earlier, the people who are going to be targeted and criminalized by that uncertainty are Black people, other folks of color, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, the same communities that are marginalized by criminal and other legal systems.
Yeah, just on Hillary's point of this chilling effect, I have two thoughts. One is in the employment context, right? What civil actions are now going to be filed against employers to challenge those employers' policies, employers who are trying to provide abortion care benefits to employees, right? So what chilling effect does that have on employers, and how does that affect their employees who are trying to access this healthcare? In terms of another sort of chilling effect, I was at a summit last month where it was said that now half of medical students are in states with abortion bans. Those medical students are not learning how to provide this care. And so there's sort of a not quite so much a chilling effect specifically, but again, if we're talking about the consequences for people who are seeking abortion care services, healthcare services related to pregnancy outcomes in general, where they are going to be able to do that, and who their providers are is now incredibly limited.
Maybe the way I think about it, which is even grimmer than what Rhiannon just said, is imagine if every consequential life decision you had to make for the rest of your life required talking to a panel of 6 lawyers. That's the nature of chilling, and that's the point, right? The point is we're going to wait till you're bleeding out, till you're septic. We're going to wait till, some bunch of hospital attorneys think that now is the time that you can do a life-saving intervention because you couldn't do what is just standard good medicine before. And I think that the that chaos is the point. That uncertainty is the point. Having clinics in Arizona open, close, having providers not know from 1 week to the next what is lawful, that's not an accident. That chilling is the point, which is to make everyone terrified to move. And if the people at the very, very top of the healthcare pyramids, we just heard about med students, but physicians and nurses and guidance counselors and the people who need to be able to quickly and accurately convey facts, if every one of those people feels that they are going to be bankrupt because they're going to be hauled into court across the country, you've already achieved everything you wanted to achieve without doing anything at all.
We spoke earlier about federal court challenges, and we're seeing the beginning of what those cases might look like. The EMTALA case in Idaho comes to mind, and the discussions around cases in which Washington could preempt state bans on medication abortion. But bigger picture, what are the legal challenges we might expect from the federal government and through the federal courts at large? Hillary, I'm especially curious to hear what you're thinking on this front.
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to the previous question just about chaos and uncertainty, right? Although an imperfect system, we were able to often go to federal court to block laws and to seek that certainty, which just is not as viable an option now. The federal courts have gotten even more hostile than they were just a few years ago. And yes, the federal government has brought some challenges and is defending some challenges that have been brought against them, both in the abortion context and contraception. I'm thinking of the ruling on Title X and minors' access to contraception in Texas. So it's an uphill battle. I mean, I don't have any sort of silver bullet answer to the question of how we rebuild the right in federal court tomorrow, but we have so many challenges pending in state courts right now. That's a lot of where we're trying to seek certainty and block bans, but that's going to result in a patchwork of rights across the country, which again, I don't want to undermine the real harm and chaos that overruling Roe has had, but it was building on an already sort of patchwork system where access in Texas is not access in California, and et cetera. So we've had some real victories in state courts that we will continue to defend and continue to seek, but the federal court landscape is really, really tough, to just be very transparent about it. We're not giving up, but it's really tough.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that in terms of federal court battles, battles with the federal government, I think it's important too to see how a conservative legal movement is stacking their issues on top of one another, right? So, these kinds of cases overlap with conservative attacks on the administrative state, right? The ability of administrative agencies like the FDA, the EPA, and so many others to carry out their regulatory functions, right? I'm thinking in particular about a case that was filed in the Northern District of Texas. This is a federal court, Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, the FDA. The plaintiffs here represented by the Alliance for Defending Freedom. They're bringing suit under the Administrative Procedure Act to argue that the FDA's approval and regulation of medication abortion is outside the agency's jurisdiction, right? And that it is arbitrary and capricious. And so just noting that these issues that the conservative legal movement has been attacking on for the course of decades, they're all interlocking, and sort of the legal response, like Hillary has been saying, it's really hard to be piecing together on all of these fronts.
Two quick beats on two pieces of this. One is the burgeoning religious liberty exemption claims that you're going to start to see more and more and more, right? You're already seeing pharmacists who are refusing to administer, what they deem to be abortifacients, using the sort of shield of this is my religious liberty, methotrexate, for patients who are not seeking to abort, who have, existential medical needs. And you're already seeing the burgeoning of that. And it marries, as Rhiannon just said, to 303 Creative, right? The LGBTQ case that the court heard this year about how providers are going to be able to use religious liberty exemptions more and more broadly to claim that they shouldn't be subject to, even their own state laws about what is and is not permissible. And I think that is part of this network, this sort of web of attacks that comes in all sorts of different guises, but is all working to sort of privilege religious conscience as somehow the preeminent, most important constitutional value that trumps all others. The only other thing I want to say, and I think it goes to Hillary's point about federal versus state courts, is we're just already starting to see, state Supreme Courts in Idaho, in South Carolina, come to really different decisions under state constitutional provisions about abortion. And I just want to flag that all those millions and millions, and in fact billions of dollars that Leonard Leo has been using to stack the federal courts are now being directed at stacking state courts, and that the cheapest thing in the world, if you want to buy one for yourself, is a state Supreme Court seat. And it is absolutely the case that the decades-long effort to kind of buy and own the federal courts has absolutely leached now into state Supreme Court races and other state court races. And so that sense that there's a demarcation of, what the conservative legal movement was willing to sort of own with dark money purchases, I think is no longer actually relevant. I think it's very, very much the case that state Supreme Courts are in play and they're not super expensive to purchase.
One last question on the federal front. Are there things that you expected to see from the federal government, the DOJ or HHS or other agencies that have legal power challenges that we could see that you thought we would have seen by now that we haven't?
Yeah, I think we've seen some actions from the federal government, right? They recently loosened some restrictions on access to medication abortion. There are still a lot of restrictions on access to medication abortion at the federal level in addition to the state level. So I think there is still a tremendous amount that can be done, whether in the form of lawsuits or administrative changes. So I always think there's more to be done. I do think, of course, like the Biden administration is trying much more than an alternative administration might be. But I don't have any sort of inside knowledge as to like next week, this is what's going to be filed. But I think, advocates have been working closely to try to push the administration to do as much as possible, because it really is. We talked at the beginning about the kind of chaos and harm. Like, I don't think it can be understated, sort of the public health crisis that this has brought about, right? That headline may have been in the news in the weeks after Dobbs, but the reality is still basically the same. In some states, we've been able to keep clinics open and block bans, but still there's, an incredible, right across the South and Midwest, there's still an absolute vacuum of true access to abortion the way it really should be.
Maybe this is a good place to make I feel like I'm really the gloomy Gus here, but I think just to add the footnote to what Hillary just said, which is there's a boldness gap here. And so it feels as though for every step that the Biden administration takes, there is some wacky state AG who's just willing to go for a big swing. And that's not the fault of the Biden administration. As I said earlier, if you have the Attorney General from Alabama saying, I don't care if medication abortion is now more readily available, because we're going to come after people for chemical endangerment under our criminal chemical endangerment statute. And even though that is completely inapt, it's not in any way relevant to what it is that medication abortion provides. If you're brave enough to start criminally going after people, it's just this sort of huge three-dimensional whack-a-mole. And so I think, I want to big props to the Biden administration for seating really, really good federal judges, including some federal judges who care deeply about this issue. That's important. But I also think if you have a sense, and we see this in so many contexts at the Supreme Court, that you have a 6-3 supermajority to get anything you want, you're going to see some really crazy, draconian, emboldened state action, even in the face of the kind of attempts to expand reproductive justice and reproductive freedom on the part of the Biden administration. I'll stop being depressing now, but that is, I think, just that gap is really, really profound right now.
Going back to a point that Hillary made earlier, I mean, to what extent then is this an issue that will be decided entirely in state courts? Is there room for the federal judiciary at all? And I mean, does that state-by-state strategy, is that in some way playing defense?
I think the state-by-state strategy is a reality where we are, right? And I think that the people who are doing work in reproductive justice in this kind of litigation to protect reproductive rights are sort of necessarily in state court, because that's where the law is happening right now after Roe. But I do want to say that there have been some great wins in state court so far. I know that really amazing litigation and strategy are happening across the country in state courts. Just in my opinion, I think efforts to enshrine state abortion protections via state courts, I think, is going to necessarily be hit or miss. Whether, if that's defensive posturing, that is what it is. But I mean, it's just going to be completely dependent on the makeup of state courts. I think back in 2020, Ballotpedia found that there were 15 states with Democrat-controlled state courts, 27 states with Republican-controlled courts. The rest of the courts were split. And so, it's whack-a-mole. It is, again, to use the word chaotic. It's going to be hit or miss in state court, depending on where you are. But that is where we are.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on that, I think, reproductive rights lawyers and others, right, have been litigating in state courts for decades. It's sort of not a new strategy. It's just, right, as it's newly important, right? Because the federal right has been overruled and because the federal judiciary is so much more hostile. And I just wanted sort of to note, it's both about going into states to try to get courts to recognize new protections for reproductive freedom under right equality, liberty, life, right to health protections, whatever they may be. And also defending the wins that we have had. So the center litigated a case in Kansas where the Kansas Supreme Court in 2019 found their constitution guarantees the right to abortion, and voters rejected an effort to overrule that decision this summer. And we have, two arguments coming up in Kansas. So the court will apply that decision. So the same thing in Montana. There's going to be an argument in the Georgia Supreme Court, not on like right to abortion, but on Georgia's abortion ban. So there's a tremendous amount of activity in the state courts, and the kind of wins and losses sort of may shift day to day and month to month. So it's not a be-all end-all solution, right? We need a federal constitutional right or a federal statutory right that we can actually have the same rights regardless of where you live in the country.
I have optimism. I have one slightly happy point, which is it's not necessarily going to solve the state court problem, but state ballot initiatives. Holy cow, that has been such a massive success story. And I think if you think about, the 5 attempts to do this on the ballot during the midterms, including in ruby red states where nobody thought it would happen, and Kansas right after Dobbs, I think one of the things that has been really interesting to watch is that when you put reproductive rights directly on the ballot without the magic of gerrymandering and vote suppression, abortion rights seem to win. And I think one of the things to think about, I mean, Hillary will tell me if I'm wrong, but every single state that can possibly put this issue up on the ballot should be doing that yesterday, right? Because that is a place that we have seen massive wins. And I think it's one of those places where all the energy post Dobbs that was how can a Supreme Court do this seems to have funneled into, and if you look at the sort of knock-on effects in Michigan, that's unbelievably important to see that energy being directed to what feels like a really huge and significant win in the states.
Yeah, so I will agree and also add a depressing note then to say, like, yes, absolutely, we should be using sort of all of our strategies at, as many as possible. But right, it always worries me a little bit to rely on voters, right? This is sort of somewhat akin to what Justice Alito said in Dobbs, that women have political power, and it's like, okay, but the same states that are banning abortion have the highest number of voter restrictions and have disenfranchised people for decades. So it's that always gives me a little pause. So like, yes, and we have to sort of do all of these things.
One legal question that I have been really interested in is the uncertainty around the pre-Roe bans, right? Those laws that were passed decades ago, in some case more than 100 years ago, were never repealed. And it seems that state courts have gone in really different directions in answering whether these have enforcement power, whether they can affect people's access to abortion. Are there any legal analogies or precedents that you all think about that might help us better understand where we're going in this and how the question of a pre-Roe ban might play out in the coming months or years?
I mean, just to think about Arizona, that's a pre-Roe ban, so the zombie law that came back to life and is currently blocked. I think when this airs, we can see if that is different, but it should continue to be blocked. And the court found sort of that the landscape of abortion restrictions that the state had passed over the years sort of impliedly repealed, in a way, the pre-Roe ban, that you can't harmonize a total ban with all of these restrictions, and the restrictions are newer, so we're going with those. So I think there are some creative, either statutory interpretation or other liberty right to abortion arguments that may also be successful in keeping those blocked. But it's just a really kind of the idea that a 50-year-old laws from even further back can just spring back into life because of something the Supreme Court does in 2022, just as a practical matter seems wrong and sort of anti-democratic, that if the state wants to pass a ban, it should do so today so that, it's accountable to the voters today. Just the idea that these laws can kind of come back from the dead is, this is not a legal term. It just seems particularly cruel and anti-democratic.
Yeah, just to piggyback a little bit off of that, and I kind of want to highlight a point that I think Dahlia made earlier, that the chaos, all of the questions, the confusion, that is the point. And you have to ask yourself, who does that benefit right now, right? Because it's not benefiting people who need this kind of access, who need their access to abortion care, pregnancy-related care, really sort of a basic health care. And yet the Supreme Court, in writing Dobbs, did so under the guise that this makes the country more democratic, right? Or that actually Roe v. Wade caused chaos and misunderstandings of the Constitution, what have you. And so just to say, questions like that we're contending with now about, can a 100-year-old law that was never repealed now come, back into sort of legitimacy and can be enforced? That's exactly the confusing context that was, I think, in bad faith and disingenuously created by Dobbs directly.
And maybe this is a good point to bring up the sort of dog catching the car piece of this conversation, because I think, Hillary and Rhiannon are exactly right. We are now looking at a pancaking, right? I mean, an effect of, laws that are so old and so cruel, being pancaked upon, other laws from the 70s, other laws from the 2010, 2015, and all of those are now being assessed by courts, as Hillary said, to figure out which of these things is meant to be, to have some kind of primacy. But I do think it raises this really interesting question, and you're seeing it play out in Arizona, where, do we really want to push for the zombie law, for the cruelest part? I mean, do we want to push for personhood? And I think this is a useful time to say, we are seeing in the very early weeks the House of Representatives passing Born Alive, their Born Alive statute, which is just, for me, absolute singularly interesting evidence of the dog catching the car, right? They could have passed a personhood ban. They could have passed, something far, far more draconian. They're afraid to. So they're going for the low-hanging fruit that actually changes very little. It signals to the base that, we're very serious about, not aborting, people who have already, graduated from college and have a car. I mean, it's just so not relevant to the actual conversation around debate that it seems empty and symbolic. And I think one of the things you're going to see, I hope, again, Hillary will check me if I'm being too optimistic, is a real retreat from bad old laws that look cruel and vicious, because nobody actually wants to put skin in the game and do things that are cruel and vicious, because the voters have shown, I think, in the midterms and in state ballot initiatives that they're really not interested in whatever they're interested in. It's not that.
I hope so. I'm going to try to go with your hope. I think that my optimism goes up and down sort of each day, because I think that's all true. And then also what Rhiannon was saying earlier about, right, prosecutors still going after people, whether the laws are old or new, either actually trying to go after folks or the fear that they will still have a really detrimental impact on people's lives. So I'm holding both of these things together.
One of the pre-robe bans I've been really interested in, which we haven't talked about, is the one in Texas, which seems to have no chance of being repealed and has really striking aid and abetting language, right? That one of the main reasons abortion funds in the state no longer operate. I mean, what does it tell us if we are seeing states go in these very different directions, with entertaining challenges to pre-robe bans, with them being put forth? And I guess, how does that better help us understand access for real people and the sort of legal questions at play?
Yeah, it's tough. I think, I am sort of reminded of things that we've already been saying. It's almost like even the conservative legal movement has too many cooks in the kitchen right now. They are starting too many fires everywhere, right? And you see, again, with Dahlia's point about the dog kind of catching the car, it's not necessarily that there's a really sort of consolidated, focused strategy from conservatives on what they're doing to legislate around abortion and pregnancy outcomes right now. That just adds to the chaos. And like Hillary has said a couple of times, adds to a widespread chilling effect, because nobody anywhere knows what is legal, what can they do, what is going to set them up for civil or criminal liability. It just sort of it really adds to confusion and chaos, and the material impact of that is that people are not getting the healthcare that they need.
And there are actually things, right, states can do if they want to show, right, they care about pregnant people, families, and babies, right? I think part of Mississippi's brief at the Supreme Court was, I think this was after Dobbs was overruled, a press release from the Attorney General was sort of like, well, now we can start on our pro-life agenda, and it's like, the fact that abortion was legal did not stop you from trying to expand Medicaid, which you have frustrated, year after year after year. And there are so many examples like that. So, there's a long list of legislation that conservatives can get to work on passing if they're serious about this, which again, of course they're not. It's a line that they care about controlling people's lives and banning abortion, not actually protecting pregnant people and families.
Yeah, completely in bad faith, right? All of it is completely in bad faith.
And to, I think, what Rhiannon said right at the beginning, which is watching how quickly this has leached into birth control, watching how quickly it has leached into pregnancy and miscarriage, right? I mean, all you need to do is read Michelle Goodwin, read Dorothy Roberts, who were telling us 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that if you are going to go after pregnancy, you're going to go after, as we've all been saying, the most vulnerable pregnant people, but also you're going to start to look at a world in which simply parenting is criminalized, right? That the act of parenting while not having the resources to parent is going to be criminalized. And that's Dorothy Roberts' whole, fear of kids in foster care, which is her most recent book. But I think it's really, I think we've all said this in different ways, but it's worth saying it explicitly. It's all part of this bigger program that obviously doesn't stop at abortion. It's about women and fertility and being in the home and being forced to care for children you can't possibly care for, and then care for more children you can't possibly care for. And it really dovetails with, the brief that Justice Alito chose to ignore about economic opportunity and equality and all the ways in which this isn't just about privacy or, intimate familial decisions. This is about having some opportunity to succeed in the workplace. And none of that was interesting to Justice Alito. But I think if you reverse engineer his complete lack of interest in those questions, you get to the plan, which is to make sure that this is an absolutely creepy sort of Handmaid's Tale world in which women are afraid to, have children, to bear children, to raise their children, to try to support their children, because none of this works if the whole kind of Jenga thing is really predicated on controlling fertility and pregnant people's bodies.
This was alluded to earlier, but one of the elements in, I believe, Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence that many of us, I remember, were really struck by was the conversation around travel bans. As we look to state legislatures coming back, thinking about how to move beyond, just an abortion ban, how seriously should we be thinking about restrictions on travel? And maybe more importantly, what kind of legal questions does that raise?
Yeah, so I certainly expect some to be proposed. We'll see, right? If Dahlia's right that maybe they're afraid to actually get it across the finish line. And, I think the flip side is states have been passing shield laws that would protect providers who are providing across state lines. So inevitably we are going to see, legislation at cross purposes and inevitably litigation, again, in either state or federal courts that sort of adds to this chaos. Sorry to just kind of repeat that theme here. But yes, I expect states to try it. And that's really scary and just it's sort of another way in which abortion is exceptionalized, right? If your provider prescribes you medication across state lines, maybe technically they shouldn't be doing that. But, more often than not, people aren't going to get in trouble because it's not abortion or, it's, a more privileged, provider or patient getting that care, but abortion, there's a spotlight on it. So sort of adds to that concern around risk.
I would just commend to folks, because I think it's such a deeply smart law review, The New Abortion Battleground by David Cohen and Greer Donnelly and Rachel Rebouche, which is, I think, probably, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, I think it's sort of the definitive sprawling, here are all the problems, and here's why, when Justice Kavanaugh sort of shrugs and says, nobody's going to burden interstate travel without I think without citation, that actually like what, and this is Rhiannon's earlier point, that all the promises that this was going to solve everything is actually the opposite. It opens a Pandora's box of interstate travel. But I think one of the reasons that law review was so prescient and smart was that it just kind of peels the onion and shows you all the layers in which this has to burden interstate travel. And anyone cavalierly saying like, not to worry, that's not a problem, probably doesn't know exactly what's coming.
I know we're running toward the end of our time together, and I do want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about the implications Dobbs has for other rights, right, that are protected or have been protected historically under the same framework as the right to an abortion, the right to contraception, to marriage equality, to interracial marriage, etc. I mean, do we expect to see Dobbs used as a basis for eliminating these protections? And longer term, what consequences for gender equity at large are you keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, look, Alito is saying it explicitly in the Dobbs opinion, right? And I just want to highlight what he's saying explicitly is that, immediately on the chopping block, I think, are gay and trans rights. Alito heavily implying that decisions like Lawrence, Obergefell were explicitly incorrectly decided, right? And I think from that point, I just want to highlight how it is, you see in this opinion, how the conservative justices on the Supreme Court are communicating to their base, right? Alito is saying, by saying something like that, Alito is saying, bring these legal challenges, right? So that we can decide on them, so that the federal courts have something to say about this. And he's also signaling, right, how a conservative supermajority would likely approach the issue. The other thing I want to highlight is that in attacking, broadly the idea of substantive due process, which is where the right to privacy in the Constitution can sort of be located, contraception, education, gay and interracial marriage, freedom from excessive punitive damages, freedom of mentally ill people to live with dignity and liberty, freedom from forced sterilization. All of these rights are partly or wholly derived from the same place in the Constitution, guaranteeing due process, right, in the 14th Amendment. And so, it's not just the decisions that Alito explicitly names, but it puts, I think, in a post-Roe reality in the way the Dobbs decision was written. I think a lot of rights are certainly maybe threatened, right? In my home state, in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott said last year, I think right after Dobbs came down, that he would like to challenge the 1982 decision Plyler v. Doe that says that access to public school education for children is a fundamental right, including undocumented and migrant children. So again, following the logic of Alito's opinion in Dobbs, which says that these fundamental rights only exist if recognized historically, right? Well, the right to K through 12 education has not historically been an American value, right? That's a pretty modern conception of public school. So I think there are a lot of implications here. Again, just adding to the chaos of where the conservative legal movement can go from here.
Maybe I'll just add that whatever Justice Alito didn't say explicitly, Clarence Thomas sure did. And that was just vintage quiet parts loud. And I think it's absolutely clear that this is an emboldened Supreme Court inviting challenges, as Rhiannon just said, not just to Obergefell, but to Griswold. And I think the other piece of this is worth saying. I think I've said it before, but I'll say it again. In some sense, it's already here, right? Challenges to birth control are at the heart of Hobby Lobby. They're at the heart of refusals of service, right? As soon as any pharmacist can say Ella and Plan B are abortifacients because I say they are, it's already there. And the conversation about Griswold, in some sense, hasn't yet caught up to what we're already seeing happening on the ground. I just want to add one other gloss to what Rhiannon says, and then I really do want to hear Hillary tell me what's coming. But I think that, the reason that this substantive due process right is so important isn't just, as she says, because it really goes to the heart of family intimacy, of how you raise your children, of how you educate your children, of who can put a needle in your body, issues that actually are the things that the conservative legal movement is now objecting to, right? That's the critical race theory in schools fight. That's the fight about whether sex education can be taught in schools. That's the fight about vaccination. It's amazing to see that flipped on its head and deployed in order to fight for, the family autonomy of conservative families and not of all families. But I think the other thing I really want to say, I say this all the time, but I think it's so important, is if you go back and you look at the founding of, the drafting language around the Reconstruction Amendments, the right and liberty that was being conferred upon freed slaves was not some nothing historical right, the way Justice Alito bats it away. It was absolutely the right that freed slaves were being given after their families were ripped apart, after women's bodies were being used in order to construct units of, labor, husbands and wives, marriages that were not sanctioned and not recognized. If you look at the first things that freed slaves were posting, it was, I am looking for my son, I am looking for my husband, I am looking for my daughter. The idea that that's not a meaningful right, that substantive due process, which protects against families that are ripped apart and people who are impregnated against their will for economic reasons, to say that is not rooted in the nature of what those rights we're trying to protect is just utterly the opposite of originalism, and it is the opposite of really thinking meaningfully about what those Reconstruction Amendments were intended to do. So I just want to say the cynicism on both ends, the cynicism of saying we're going to use substantive due process claims to make sure that nobody teaches our kids about sex or nobody gives me a needle that I don't want, and also that it is not an originalist proposition to say that those amendments have nothing to do with bodily autonomy, forced pregnancy, and the ripping apart of families. Both of those things are fatuous and false.
This has been so fun and so informative, and I am so grateful to spend the past 40 minutes with you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Shefali, and thank you so much for being here, Madam Associate Attorney General.
It's so good to be here, and please feel free to call me Vanita.
Yeah, well, on the 50th anniversary of this landmark Supreme Court decision and 7 months after the Supreme Court decision that really dismantled Roe, it just feels really important to speak with you about the administration's response to the still ongoing developments in this post-Roe landscape. So I just want to start by outlining, what the Department of Justice's role is in responding to how the Dobbs decision is playing out, particularly at the state and federal level. I mean, would you say that you all are mostly on offense or mostly on defense? How would you characterize the department's strategy in really defending reproductive freedom in this moment?
So, Erin, it's a little bit of all of it, I would say. Soon after Dobbs, the Attorney General announced the creation of a reproductive rights task force here at the department. And that was really an effort to formalize ongoing work that had been going on for months, including our challenge to SB 8 out of Texas, 6 months before. And it was in anticipation, frankly, of having to be in a post-Roe landscape. But the reason for creating this task force was to be able to have senior officials and dedicated staff from over a dozen components here at the Justice Department come together, put our heads together, think creatively and collaboratively about what we could do to protect reproductive rights, reproductive health, reproductive justice in this new world. And for the last 6 months, obviously, the landscape has been changing almost daily, and it's going to continue to do that. And but the task force has been able to, be very vigilant about monitoring developments in the states. We have engaged in affirmative litigation. We have been in a defensive posture, defending agencies that are getting challenged for rules that they're seeking to ensure reproductive access. We have been advising agencies about how they can expand and ensure reproductive health access in this moment. We've been providing technical assistance. We've met with a lot of stakeholders, and part of the reason for doing that is really to make sure that we are hearing from some of the most vulnerable among us. We know that Dobbs has had a uniquely devastating impact on people of color and low-income women in particular. And so making sure that we have our ear to the ground, talking to community groups, et cetera, about what's actually happening in real communities has been a part of the task force's work too. We also enforce the FACE Act, which ensures access to abortion clinics and reproductive health care, even including pregnancy resource centers as well. The act is actually a pretty broad law. So all of this is to say that we've been taking an all hands approach to ensuring that in this post-Dobbs world, the Justice Department can use every tool at our disposal to protect reproductive rights.
Yeah, and you do mention that disparate impact. I'm wondering if you can really talk about so many of the laws restricting abortion access are in the South, where we know, for example, a lot of Black Americans, a lot of people of color live. How are you thinking about that disparity potentially? I mean, particularly because also you have Black Americans who we know are disproportionately impacted by maternal mortality as well.
Yeah, it's, we have been very keenly aware, in the Attorney General's first and very long statement after the Dobbs decision, he named what we knew was going to be unequal impact on people of color. And it's something that we are really vigilant about. We have been monitoring developments at the local and state level and looking at state actions and evaluating them to see whether they infringe on federal protections and federal law. And we're not going to hesitate to act where we see state laws that are infringing on federal protections. And we have to make sure, though, that we are hearing from some of the most vulnerable among us to make sure that we know what's actually happening on the ground. As I said, there's daily developments, changes in laws, and I think that will likely intensify as state legislatures go into session now. Many of them have not been in session actually since the Dobbs decision and are now going into session. So we are paying attention to that and to this particular dynamic as well.
Yeah, I want to ask you about state legislatures, because you're right, they are reconvening this month, and we know that we could see more actions in Republican control. We already are Republican controlled state houses to further restrict abortion access. I know the department is monitoring legislation that could be in violation of federal law and is prepared to act should those proposals become laws. I guess, can you say anything else about that particular challenge, and if there are currently states that you are watching in this regard, as the current legislative session gets underway?
Well, let me talk to you about what we've done in our Idaho litigation, for example. We filed suit against the state of Idaho last August under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. It's called EMTALA. And that law provides that every hospital that receives Medicare funds has to provide stabilizing treatment for it that could include abortion care in some instances for patients who arrive at emergency rooms with medical conditions that may be threatening their life or putting their health in serious condition. And we filed that lawsuit. Idaho had a near total abortion ban, and we were able to obtain a preliminary injunction against the enforcement of that law as it pertains to EMTALA. So that's the type of thing that we are monitoring. We found that law, was infringed on federal protections, and we didn't hesitate to act. And so that is what we are going to be looking at. We are looking and evaluating state and local laws, as I said, and if they infringe on federal law, we're going to take steps to take action. And we hope also that our litigation is going to have a deterrent effect, at least in some parts of the country, around states that are thinking of taking these types of actions. The Justice Department put this task force structure together. It's unprecedented, and it is really important that we have the resources to bring to bear in this moment when there is so much concern and fear in communities around their ability to access reproductive health care. And often in times where women are at our most vulnerable, people are at their most vulnerable and so it's that much more incumbent that the Justice Department be seen and understood as playing an important role in this effort.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up EMTALA because, I hear you saying that you're hoping that these actions do deter states from taking action that could run afoul of that law. But I mean, has there been a chilling effect? Have you seen that among providers? What are you hearing from pregnant people who are concerned about what may happen to them if their life is in danger due to their pregnancy? And what do you tell them that the department can do?
I mean, we've heard from doctors that were gratified when we filed the litigation in Idaho, because I think a lot of them were wondering, my gosh, what happens if a patient comes to us in exactly that type of condition where they need emergency care? And, the doctor may be afraid of, having repercussions against them for acting in accordance with federal law. And so when the Justice Department takes action, our goal is also to signal not just to the states that may be violating federal law, but also to patients, to providers, to their families, to reassure them that the Justice Department is active and not sitting back in this moment. And look, we understand that there is great fear and confusion in the country, in part because of the changing landscape. And we are not the only ones engaged in this work. Obviously, there's pro bono counsel, there's efforts, afoot outside of the government. But our role here at the Justice Department is to make sure that the levers of the federal government can be brought to bear. We enforce the law here at the Justice Department, but we're also in daily, communication with HHS, with Health and Human Services, with the VA, with DOD. We just recently helped advise the Department of Defense, the Veterans Affairs, the Department of Veterans Affairs, HHS regularly on rules or guidance that they're putting out that interprets the law and tries to provide some assurances to, for example, service members or veterans, as is the case. As they're putting out, guidance to ensure that their constituents have access to reproductive health services. And so this is part of ongoing work that we will continue to do.
Yeah, I want to stick with you on the point about the department being on offense, if you will. Part of, I know that reproductive rights task force that you chair, part of the charge is to monitor actions that threaten access to mifepristone, and so I'm wondering if your department has considered filing a lawsuit in one of the states that has banned abortion under 10 weeks, since FDA authority is generally assumed and FDA has approved that drug for 10 weeks. Have you considered filing a lawsuit in one of those states?
So I can't speak to you about what we are thinking about or considering before filing, but what I can say is we are vigorously defending the FDA in litigation that is challenging actions that the agency took 22 years ago with regards to abortion medication. We are defending the FDA and will continue to do so in that lawsuit. Another kind of action that was taken was by our Office of Legal Counsel on this very issue. The Office of Legal Counsel is the branch of the Justice Department that provides legal advice to executive agencies across the government. And just a few weeks ago, the Office of Legal Counsel published an opinion addressing a question from the U.S. Postal Service that the Federal Comstock Act is not a general barrier to the mailing or other delivery of mifepristone. And we're going to closely scrutinize any and all state actions with respect to abortion medication where states may be trying to infringe on lawful federal actions and protections. So these are some examples of how we're engaging in this work. And sometimes being in a defensive posture actually gives us the room to go on the offense in this weird way. But we are doing this and defending the FDA and making clear that its actions with regards to mifepristone that are being challenged, actions again that were taken over the last 22 years were lawful, and that the challenge that's being brought should fail.
Well, you mentioned kind of that network of folks in the legal community that you are also working with. I know your agency is also,
charged with implementing President Biden's executive order to protect access to reproductive health care services. And part of that work does involve working with lawyers on the ground, encouraging them, educating them, assisting them in defending legal reproductive access at the state level. What are you hearing from those folks about this fast changing landscape? And just talk a little bit more about how the department is responding on their behalf.
Yeah. So, I think all of us have had a lot of questions about, what is legal, can a state, do X or Y? And in the immediate aftermath of Dobbs, we were met with an onslaught of questions. And we actually in July had a meeting the Justice Department did with White House counsel's office that pulled together pro bono counsel from law firms around the country, law professors, people who are running law clinics, bar associations, and the like, really in an effort to identify gaps in legal assistance so that people who are in need and who have these questions are able to have some guidance. And I'm happy to say that there's been a kind of cooperating network of pro bono counsel that has stood up a clearinghouse of sorts to be able to meet that need. And so we're kind of building the plane as we fly it in this new post-Roe world. But that is what we are being called to do.
Well, I also want to ask you, because you lead the National Task Force on Violence Against Healthcare Providers. And I just really want to ask what that work has been like since the Dobbs decision. I mean, did this task force come about in anticipation of the violence or in response to the violence that we might be seeing on the ground?
So the task force is actually coordinated by the Civil Rights Division here at the Justice Department. And it was started many years ago, long before Dobbs, as part of a way to ensure that these clinics understood the protections of the FACE Act in particular. The FACE Act prohibits anyone from obstructing access to reproductive health services through violence, threats of violence, or property damage. And the statute, as I said, protects all patients, providers, and facilities that provide reproductive health services, including pro-life pregnancy counseling services, but any other pregnancy support facility that's providing reproductive care. And so it's an important network that meets regularly and that is able to share information and ensure that the Justice Department can make sure that we are enforcing the FACE Act vigorously wherever we can. Of course, since Dobbs, it has been important for us to be able to hear from that network. And we have taken action in the last 2 years, even before Dobbs, in close to 24 cases where we have charged FACE Act violations. And we will continue to rely on that network to make sure that the FACE Act is being fully and vigorously enforced by the Justice Department.
I was actually going to ask you about the FACE Act, the Freedom to Access Clinical Entrances Act, because in recent months we have seen several prosecutions across the country, particularly in the wake of Dobbs, but even hearing you say over the last 2 years, this has been something, so maybe even leading up to Dobbs, something that you all were seeing. What can you say about that kind of activity in recent years and about the work that you all are doing now to really enforce that act?
So it's work that's been important to the Justice Department for years. And we've recently charged cases and obtained conviction in cases involving unlawful threats, bomb threats to clinics, involving people who are obstructing access to clinics around the country. And we have been also very vigilant. There's also, after Dobbs, been concerns and allegations about threats to pro-life pregnancy centers. So we're looking at everything and all of the facts that are before us. Enforcement of this act has been really important to the Civil Rights Division. The Civil Rights Division has been doing this work for years. And I think that we are monitoring access and any violations to the FACE Act now, as we have before, but also hearing about more concerns from providers and clinics. And so we're taking those seriously and investigating, and we're trying to make sure that people know that we are here and understand really the protections of the FACE Act, because we've also found that in a lot of places, people didn't understand the full protections of the FACE Act. So that's part of our stakeholder outreach and why this network of providers and the kind of outreach that we're doing is really important.
Yeah, I think to your point about the lack of understanding, I think you're making such an important note that this includes people, providers on both sides of this issue. The pro-life pregnancy centers as well are part of what is protected under this Freedom to Access Clinical Entrances Act. Is that something that you also have seen that people may not have been aware of, or is that a big piece of the education that you're having to do around this law?
Yeah, I mean, this is one piece of education that we're doing about, a lot of people didn't know about EMTALA either before, but on the FACE Act, I think people were not aware of the full breadth of its protection. So we have met with, a lot of abortion providers, as we have with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, as well as, pregnancy resource centers, as well as, organizations that are providing reproductive health care access. So this is, we have laws on the books, but our laws are only as good as the vigilance we bring and the enforcement we take. And so where the facts in the law make out a FACE Act violation, the department's not hesitating to act. And that's why you're seeing some of the more recent announcements.
Yeah. I want to ask too about, how you see reproductive freedom as potentially tied to other freedoms that could be threatened by the Dobbs decision in this post-Roe era. Do you see them as tied to other reproductive freedom, tied to other freedom? And if so, in what ways?
I have been a civil rights lawyer my whole career, as you well know, Erin, and I see our ability to protect constitutional rights, to ensure hard-fought wins and progress in this country as being of a piece. There is no question that our history and our progress in this country has never been linear. There have always been setbacks. Sometimes it feels like we take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it feels like we're taking 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But the reality is that Dobbs will not be the last word on reproductive health and freedom. And it won't be the last word because people around the country are mobilizing to ensure that federal law will be protected. And while this was the first time that we've seen really a retraction of a constitutional right in this manner, it's why the Justice Department set up this task force so that we could have the infrastructure to do what we can to protect reproductive freedom and rights in this post-Roe world. But it is always required. Every bit of civil rights progress that we have achieved in this country has always required great vigilance. And it's been something we've never and should never take for granted. And I view that as part of the kind of work we're doing today. The reason why Dobbs won't be the last word is because people are continuing to think creatively, to look at the levers we have, to look at how we can, make sure that we're protecting reproductive health and access. And so that is how I view this as of a piece. I think that there's always been challenges in this work, and we will continue to confront them. And I say, and I've said this before in a lot of other contexts, but that despair is not an option. And that this is a moment actually to have hope in that people are, I think, not taking these issues for granted and are understanding what's at stake and what kind of effort must be brought to bear, what kind of coordination, what kind of collaboration, what kind of creative thinking has to be brought to bear to maintain some of these fundamentals of our American democracy.
Yeah, well, I know that the department is continuing to do all of that. I just wonder, before I let you go here, if you can talk about, as chair of the Reproductive Rights Task Force, what the work ahead is that you're thinking about on this anniversary and going forward.
Yeah, we are looking back at what we've done. I think we've done a lot in the last 6 months if we're just talking about a post-Dobbs world, but we understand that there's a lot more to come. So we are continuing to engage with other federal agencies to look at what else do we have as levers at our disposal to protect reproductive rights. We are continuing to hear from stakeholders, from patients, from providers, from others to make sure we know what's happening on the ground as states might be enacting new laws, ones that both expand reproductive access and ones that are contracting them, and that we are poised to take action where federal law is being violated, and we're going to continue this work. I think the energy behind the task force and the energy behind the components that are doing this work is only greater. It has not subsided. I think that we are heartened by some of our wins and some of what we're doing, but we know that almost every move we make will be challenged, and we'll be ready to meet that challenge.
Well, I also just wonder, I mean, you coming into this role, I wonder if you could have imagined that this was going to be this seismic decision last summer was going to be such a huge part of what your job was going to be, and how you just think about how your career up to that point really prepared you to meet this moment.
Yeah, I'm a civil rights lawyer by trade, and so I'm an eternal optimist, but we've been through a lot, and I knew coming into the department the second go around that we would be confronting some serious challenges. We had seen some erosions to Roe, but there was nothing to take away the devastating gut punch the day that the Dobbs decision was issued. But that said, I am so proud to be a part of this Justice Department and to work with an Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General and senior leadership here that is very clear-eyed about the moment that we're in, and that has had a really focused attention on these issues and understands the ways in which communities around the country look to the Justice Department to both be a backstop, but also to take forward action on these types of what can seem like insurmountable problems. We've done it before here at the Justice Department, and I have full confidence that we're doing it and we'll do it again.
Well, that seems like a good note to end on. I want to thank you so much, Madam Associate Attorney General, for updating us on the administration's response in the post-Roe era.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you for joining us today for this conversation on abortion in the states. Joining us, we have Senator Mia McLeod, South Carolina State Senator, and Elizabeth Nash, the Principal Policy Associate at the Gupta Institute. So to start, Elizabeth, I would just love to hear from you on how you see the state of the states right now. Where are we at the start of 2023? And what do you think we really learned about what's happening in terms of abortion access in the states from what happened in 2022?
Okay, so we are at really the beginning, right? Certainly we've had the 6 months, we've had those special sessions. Senator McLeod can talk about what that meant in South Carolina, but we've had sort of some entry into what this post-Roe world looks like, but we only have like this much of knowledge. And so what we're really anticipating though are the conservative states to continue to push forward on abortion bans and restrictions, really expecting that in the states that have banned abortion, for them to try to pile on more restrictions so that it's even harder to access abortion, particularly around like medication abortion. And we're expecting conservative states that haven't banned abortion to try to ban abortion, such as states like Nebraska. And then we're looking for what's going to happen in those progressive states that have come out in force in support of abortion rights, and what more can they do to protect abortion this year.
And Senator, how would you describe what, especially these past 6 months, let's say, since the Dobbs ruling, what's happening in South Carolina? And what do you think is important for people to know about what has happened there, and how you feel like that is representative of what you feel is happening nationwide right now in this post-Dobbs climate?
In a word, crazy would be an accurate description. In South Carolina, I mean, we are a pretty accurate reflection of what we're seeing happening nationally. And it's so disheartening to see the level of consistency that these extremists are going to when it comes to banning everything around abortions and, like insurance bans and access to medication. And, we're also seeing legislation being introduced again, knowing that it will face legal challenges and mounting resources and expenses, but that doesn't seem to dissuade those who continue to push this extremist agenda. So that's what we're seeing here, and that's what we've been seeing. It's just they're leveling up now that Roe has been overturned.
And what do you hear from constituents? What would you describe what the climate is like on the ground and what it feels like to be? I live in Georgia, you're in South Carolina. How do you explain to someone what it's like to be in one of these states where there's a lot of activity in terms of things coming out of state houses, in terms of restrictions to abortion access?
What I'm hearing on the ground is what I've always heard on the ground. I mean, women and girls are terrified. They're looking at, not just what's happening here in South Carolina, but what's happening nationally, and just trying to, I guess, wrap their brains around what the impact will ultimately be. I mean, we're still seeing it unfold, and I believe this was in 2021 when the fetal heartbeat bill was about to pass. I went to the well of the Senate and I talked about just some of the things that were in that particular bill, like having to go to the sheriff's department. In South Carolina, if you're contemplating or considering an abortion, whether you're raped or molested or, for whatever your reasons, you would have to go to the sheriff's department and basically convince the sheriff's department that you are deserving of that option. In South Carolina, though, we had, until very recently, 46 male sheriffs. We only recently have elected a female, a woman sheriff in the Low Country. So, that alone is very telling. And I think it sent shockwaves through the communities here in South Carolina, because it just shows the level or the extent to which these folks will go to truly make sure that no access is available to women and girls who desperately need it. In addition to that, they are constantly, and when I say they, I mean my colleagues, are constantly going after women's services, programs and services that these women and girls desperately need. And, just pulling the rug out from under them when it comes to resources. So, that's what I'm afraid we'll continue to see. But on the ground, I'm also hoping that there will be a groundswell of support for the fight, and that more women and girls will engage at a higher level, because that's what's needed here. And I'm sure that's not just specific to South Carolina. That's what's needed everywhere. We need more strong, bold women to run for office. We need more women to engage at a higher level and to make sure that they understand the impact of this type of effort and legislation at the state level, so that they can help us on the ground. I mean, I'm one person and I'm fighting and have been fighting and will continue to fight, but one person can't do it all. And the reality is, at least in South Carolina, women and girls outnumber our male-dominated legislature. We outnumber men outside of the chamber. I just want that to be a reality for us inside the chamber, because that's where it counts.
Well, when we're thinking about, again, what is going on in these chambers, Elizabeth, what is important for people to know about the ways that lawmakers in various states are keeping an eye on activity in other places and looking to what is moving and moving successfully or unsuccessfully in a given state to see how that might apply to where they are.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of trends, right, is something that we've been dealing with for a long time, particularly, recently when it started with these 6-week abortion bans and these trigger bans before the Dobbs decision came down, right? You saw states across the country adopting these early and near total abortion bans. And this is how sort of the legislation moves from state to state, right? It might start in Missouri and then it moves to Georgia and South Carolina and Idaho and Louisiana, right? Like this is just the way it's worked. And so this year, though, we're in this sort of first session without essentially the guardrails of Roe v. Wade in some respects. So we're expecting to see a lot of experimentation. And so that's actually when watching all of the different states becomes even more important, because we're going to see different types of bills introduced across the country. Right now, we have legislation that's been introduced, both different types, both in Mississippi and Oklahoma, that would have the real potential for allowing prosecutors to prosecute people for self-managed abortion using chemical endangerment laws or child endangerment laws using drugs, right? Like, so seeing that potentially as a trend for this year, seeing what's happening around medication abortion and what's been introduced to limit access to medication abortion, from mailing bans to restrictions on manufacturers, that sort of thing. Anticipating, more states to adopt refusal clauses around not only abortion, but other reproductive health care as well. So, and South Carolina actually has one of these very massive refusal clauses that allows pretty much any kind of provider to refuse to do any kind of healthcare service, right? So we only have a few states with a refusal clause like that, anticipating that it might spread to other states. So just thinking that the states, if you thought they were important before June when Roe was overturned, they're more important now.
Well, on that note, I'd love to hear from both of you on in what ways, and is this even the right language, is every state in America a purple state? Do you feel like there is a real dialogue happening on the ground, no matter where you live, and maybe it iterates a little differently depending on some of these, geographic differences, but is there an intense debate happening in all states right now about what the future of this kind of holistic access to reproductive health care looks like? And what are some of the ways we're seeing this iterate? Elizabeth, do you want to start with that one first? And then I'd love to hear from you too, Senator.
Sure. So yeah, there's certainly different conversations happening, and sort of a broad brush here, thinking about the progressive states and the kind of work that they've been doing to expand access to abortion. How sustainable is that? We need, more voices being raised to say, what, we need to, make sure all the gaps are filled so that everyone can get an abortion. How are we protecting people who are coming from out of state? How are we protecting our providers and our support organizations and supporting them as well, right? So like those kinds of conversations are really happening in progressive states, while in some of the more conservative states, there are some really interesting conversations that are happening. Like if you're looking at a state like Tennessee right now, there's a conversation ongoing around exceptions to their abortion ban. Now that wouldn't have happened before. And so, and frankly, exceptions are, as the senator was talking about, incredibly hard to get an exception. They are not a means for meaningful access to abortion. But the idea that there are conservative legislators really trying to have a slightly different kind of conversation might mean that there's more of an opening for the vast majority of residents and constituents who actually support abortion rights to get in there and help the more conservative legislators sort of change their tune, essentially. And I think there is a real that around within these conservative legislatures, there is a bit of a needle to thread for them, because their much smaller base has said they support abortion bans without exceptions. But the rest of the constituents, the rest of the United States is saying, wait a minute, we actually support abortion rights. So again, to the senator's point about raising voices and coming to the fore and getting involved to make sure that, you know, there are opportunities to roll back abortion bans where possible and to stop further incursions into to restrict abortion.
And Senator, what are you thinking, to take that even a step further, to what degree, even in a place like South Carolina, does it feel like abortion is continually on the ballot box?
It does. It definitely does here. And I've been really encouraged by the fact that we have 5 women in the South Carolina Senate, 3 Republican women and 2 of us who are not Republicans. And so, you know, when I think about the fact that we can now, or we are now coming together around this issue and trying to fight these fights together, this is something that is unprecedented for us. And it's really encouraging because we agree that these these critical services should not be banned or rolled back. We agree that our physicians and healthcare practitioners should not be criminalized for doing their jobs, what they've taken an oath to do. There's just so much more that we agree on on the restrictions on access. So there are, I wouldn't describe any of us as pro-abortion, but I would describe all of us as wanting to make sure that women and girls have access to the services that they need and to be able to exercise their reproductive rights and freedoms. And that's something that has, I believe, happened or come about in a very genuine and organic way because Roe was overturned, and none of us really anticipated that. Although, you know, if we think about it, these extremists have been consistent and extremely diligent and unified in their efforts to unravel Roe as we know it. And so when it was actually overturned, I think that was a turning point for many women and girls, not just those of us who serve, not just those of us who are impacted or have our reasons for wanting to make sure that women and girls continue to have access to the services, the reproductive services that they need and reproductive health care that they need. But to have 5 women serve simultaneously and truly come together around this issue has been one of the highlights of these last few months when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The fact that we are coming together is extremely encouraging.
And Elizabeth, to kind of take that a step further, what are we seeing in states in terms of proactive measures? How are people coming together in both conservative and more progressive states to try to ensure that there are protections and that access is not just protected, but expanded?
Yeah, so I mean, most of the action, not surprisingly, is along the West Coast, the Northeast, a few states in the middle, like Illinois, and now Minnesota as well. And so they kind of come into a couple of different areas. One are legal protections, right? What's been called shield laws, where essentially the state is setting in place laws to protect providers, patients, and now some of the newer ones are really also helping protect the support organizations like abortion funds. And basically putting legal bubble wrap around them from cases being brought from banned states, for example, right? So if somebody is coming from a state where abortion is banned to a receiving state like Illinois, then there are protections in place for that patient from from Texas. And if the Texas government wanted to try to prosecute the provider, it would be very difficult for them to do so, because there are things being put in place like no extradition, no subpoenas, no summons. The state won't help the other state with the investigation, these kinds of things being put in place. There are also states looking to protect data privacy for patients, right? So also, as a way to stop another state from prosecuting a patient, for example. So those kinds of things are happening. And then there's sort of more of the on the ground stuff, right? Because the legal bubble wrap is a little abstract, but on the ground, it's things like providing funding, and funding going directly for abortion to help abortion patients not only pay for the abortion, but also in some places help with the travel costs if somebody's coming from out of state. And then another piece of this is to help build out capacity. So like, for example, New Mexico has put forth funding to help build a new clinic near its border with Texas. So, seeing some of that funding going into place, and then just expanding the provider pool, right? Ensuring that not only physicians, but other clinicians can provide abortion care. And so, basically putting all of these foundational pieces in place so that whether you're a resident of that state or someone coming from out of state, you can get the care you need. And then what we're seeing in some of the more conservative states really is similar legislation being introduced to help change the conversation, right? To help express that, abortion bans and restrictions are harmful to pregnant people and their families, and that here's actually a better path to go down. So trying to change the conversation. And those bills are really important because you can't start the conversation if you don't have the legislation introduced in the first place.
And Senator, what has that looked like in South Carolina, and how have you been involved in that work? And what's important for people to know about not writing off states that they may think of as conservative states or states hostile to abortion access?
Well, I hope they won't write us off. I've been at the forefront of introducing out-of-the-box legislation as it relates to abortion care and women's rights and reproductive freedoms and the services around those. For instance, my Viagra bill, the bill that I introduced in 2016, a lot of critics wanted to say, oh, it's a tongue-in-cheek response. It has no chance of passing. And the reality is that it ignited a totally different conversation about what that looks like around men's reproductive rights and men's.
Can you explain a little about exactly what was in that bill too, for someone
who yes, I can. I was in the House at the time, and the Speaker appointed me to sit on a committee that was tasked with listening to an entire summer of testimony around why Planned Parenthood should be defunded. Planned Parenthood, as everyone knows, is not a state agency. So it really was a waste of our time and resources and energy. But I listened intently, trying to understand and make sense of where it was going and why this was such an important issue that it had to be prioritized over the summer. And what I discovered was that in South Carolina, there are ridiculous hoops and hurdles that women and girls are required to jump through. And as a sexual assault survivor, I was deeply offended and disheartened by the rhetoric that is kind of encapsulated in the legislation or the laws here in our state. I mean, we require women and girls to bring a note, just demeaning, humiliating, unnecessary tactics to dissuade women and girls from seeking the kind of care that they feel that they need. And so I looked at the requirements of women and girls, including the notes and coming back in 24 hours after you've had time to think about it and pray about it. And I just made those same requirements apply to men who are seeking Viagra. As we know, this isn't a one-sided equation, although we often discuss it as if it is, but women and girls cannot impregnate themselves. And so, I wanted to make sure that people understood that Viagra is not an erectile dysfunction drug. It is a heart. It is prescribed, or was traditionally and medically prescribed for men who suffer with a specific heart condition. And so to use it for its unintended purposes, I wanted an opportunity and sought an opportunity to kind of expound on that and to enlighten people about, what we're doing and what we're not doing in South Carolina as it relates to women's and men's sexual health and reproductive health. So it was not a tongue-in-cheek piece of legislation. Did I expect it to pass? No, of course not, in our male-dominated legislature. But what I also didn't expect was that it would garner the kind of interest and excitement and energy, not only nationwide, but internationally. I was getting media requests from media outlets across the country and outside of the country. And so, it just speaks to the need for those of us who serve and those of us who don't to always seize every opportunity to expand the conversation, to broaden the conversation, to bring people in and to expose the hypocrisies, the ridiculousness of certain laws in certain states like ours here in South Carolina. And I was able to do that successfully through that bill. The other bill that got a lot of traction and national attention was my Pro-Birth Accountability Act, because at the same time that these pro-birth legislators love to harp on, or describe themselves as being pro-life, they are passing bills like the fetal heartbeat bill here, and at the same time cutting the very programs and services that women and girls need to be able to provide for themselves and their babies. So, put your money where your mouth was my thought behind that particular piece of legislation, because as a mother, as a sexual assault survivor, I know first, as someone who lives with sickle cell anemia, I know firsthand that there's almost no way to even foresee or anticipate the costs that are associated with, and I'm just talking financial costs. I'm not talking emotional. I'm not talking, physical. I'm only talking financial costs, and they are astronomical. If you are not in a position to care for yourself, how can you possibly be expected to care for a baby and to provide for a child who has, some have, just needs that come with being an infant, then a toddler, and we're talking daycare, we're talking medical expenses, but we also have had many women in South Carolina who have died in childbirth, who have been in a vegetative state since childbirth because of health challenges that they had going into the pregnancy or that they developed during the pregnancy. And so, we're not just talking fetal anomalies for the baby. We're talking about, challenges that these mothers face, and there's no provision for them, no real consideration of them. And so that's what that bill does. It requires the state of South Carolina to put its money where its mouth is. And if they really care about life, then they would support that legislation, because you can't give you should not give an unfunded mandate to women and girls who are already, and this was before COVID. So, it was only exacerbated by the pandemic. And here we are, we're still focused on the legislation that insists or demands that women and girls give birth regardless of their circumstances, and given very little thought or consideration to passing legislation that would support them in that mission.
With all that in mind, Elizabeth, you touched on this a little bit at the start of this conversation, but what are some of the major trends we're seeing in terms of restrictions and new restrictions to access? And how does criminalization in a broad sense factor into what these new restrictions look like now?
Yeah, well, I mean, frankly, abortion opponents are wrestling with a lot of this, because they are trying to satisfy their base, and they're trying not to upset their apple cart with the much larger rest of their constituents. And so, yes, we're anticipating that we will see more of these chemical endangerment type bills. We're anticipating we're going to see more restrictions on medication abortion, right? Medication abortion is the most used method for abortions, over half of all abortions. And it's safe and effective and can be provided in the privacy of your own home, right? And so abortion opponents want to stop this. And so they are looking for ways to make it very hard to access medication abortion. And then we anticipate to continue to see some efforts around abortion bans. So, right, in states that haven't banned abortion, but also in states where abortion bans were enacted but have been blocked by the courts. So anticipating a lot more action around abortion bans, and then some more action right around some of those progressive protective measures that we talked about. And so but additionally, where we're expecting to see some other trends is outside of abortion, around contraception and pregnancy care. And contraception, we are anticipating we will see some efforts to expand access, but actually we're really worried that we're going to see some efforts to limit access, particularly to publicly funded contraception, because what we've seen for so long is that abortion opponents have intentionally conflated contraceptives like emergency contraception and IUDs with abortion. And so anticipating that we'll see some efforts to limit access to those methods specifically, but then also anticipating we will see some efforts to limit young people's ability to consent to reproductive health care around contraception and pregnancy and STI testing and treatment. So sort of long story short, when the right to privacy was eviscerated in the Dobbs decision, that potentially also affects young people's right to privacy, and could open the door for these states to limit and require things like parental consent for these services. And that's a big problem, because what we've known over time from studies is that young people will continue to engage in sexual activity even if they can't get the healthcare they need, if parental consent is required. And we don't want that. And two, young people are smart, know how to make decisions for themselves, and know how to access healthcare when they need it, if it's available. So there's sort of issues around young people. And then thinking around pregnancy care, right? This is a huge issue. And the one the senator was really talking about, right? Like, what kind of support is put in place for people who are pregnant? And, we've seen in more progressive states where the systems and the safety nets around pregnancy care are more robust than in some of the conservative states, not entirely, but that's sort of a generalization. And we've seen some efforts in progressive states to shore up more of the pregnancy care supports. Also in some of the conservative states, we've seen some efforts, right, particularly around expanding Medicaid to 12 months postpartum instead of 60 days, right? Those sorts of things. One of the things we're concerned about in the conservative states is that we will see some packages of bills around expanding pregnancy care, but there'll be more lip service than actual support. And trying to really make that point that actually we need real services, really robust funding, and have this be sustainable. You can't just pass a bill to make your abortion ban look less bad, essentially. So anyway, I hope that helps.
Yes, definitely. And we only have actually a few more minutes. I would just love to kind of get from both of you, as we wrap this up and think about the role that states are playing right now in the future of what reproductive health care looks like. And given everything you both have shared with us today, what do you really want people to know and keep in mind about what needs to be included in the conversation when we talk about abortion, and not just framing it as a federal issue in this post-Dobbs world of thinking, well, this is a federal issue, we've lost this federal protection. Why does the focus need to keep coming back to exactly what is happening on the states?
I often talk about the impact on businesses, because in South Carolina, we are not only trying to mandate what women and girls have access to as it relates to women's reproductive health care here. We have legislation on the books that will prevent them or preclude them from going outside of South Carolina to access those services, which is unconstitutional, illegal, unethical. Like you can't do that. And they need to understand that, though, because the business community also needs to engage at a higher level, because we have corporations here in South Carolina that are doing business and paying and supervising employees in other parts of the country and other states. And so to have a law like that could potentially impact a South Carolina employee or a South Carolina corporation that does business in California or New York, that's problematic for a myriad of reasons. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us to not just enlighten women and girls on the ground, but to come together where we can and where we have a common vested interest in making sure that all women and girls have access to quality reproductive health care here. It's incumbent upon us to come together and work together to ensure that we continue to provide the access to those services that our women and girls need here. So that is what I have been focused on. It's what I'll continue to be focused on in the South Carolina Senate. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to engage and to be a part of this important conversation today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, there's just anything you want to share about what is important for folks to know and centering states and focusing on states in this kind of national conversation we're having about the future of reproductive health care right now?
Yeah, I mean, the states have been where it's at for a long time. I mean, certainly, there's a lot that's to be said around the federal government, but when we're talking about access to reproductive health care, it's state policies that affect people most. And so that's where we need to put our energy. And what actually has been really galvanizing over the past 6 months is that people have been paying attention in a way that is different than before. And how can we continue that momentum, continue to pay attention, continue to fight the restrictions, continue to fight for expansions, and making sure that, certainly abortion is sort of this, what has really galvanized a lot of people, but making sure we're rolling in all of reproductive health in there, because, we need to protect all of it, because everyone is going to need some part of it at some point in their lives.
Well, thank you both so much for having this conversation with me and sharing your expertise today and talking about this really important, pressing issue that all America is grappling with right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of today's speakers for these critical conversations and to all of you for joining us today. Thanks again to our sponsor, philanthropist Laura Arnold. And last but not least, thanks to the thousands of 19th News members who support our nonprofit newsroom. Your donations make conversations like today's possible. If you're not a 19th member yet, we'd love to have you join us at 19thnews.org/membership. We look forward to welcoming you to the 19th family, and we hope to see you at our next event.